And it's so interesting looking at how Boris Johnson's premiership started. At first, people were thinking it could be one of the shortest in history, when we were seeing the Conservative Party in fourth place in some polls over that summer. But very quickly, he was able to consolidate the half of the electorate that were backing the Conservative Party and the Brexit Party, calling that general election and delivering that largest parliamentary majority for the Conservative Party since Margaret Thatcher, since 1987. It all looked like it was going rather swimmingly at the start. There was the famous Greenwich speech where he laid out this big plan for reform of the country and levelling up and everything else. And then COVID came along. I wonder if it was COVID and that global pandemic that really derailed fundamentally his premiership.
Well, I heard Boris say once in a meeting that the history of pandemics is the history of solidarity followed by anger. So I think the issue of the effect of COVID on this country is going to be with us for a very long time, both in terms of the public mood and clearly, as we see today, in terms of its effects on the economy. It's not the only thing affecting the economy. We have Russia's illegal war in Ukraine to add to that. But the effects on the economy and the debt that was incurred and those things, I mean, possibly we couldn't have avoided it, but the effects will be here a long time. But also, I think, on the public mood. And I think, you know, when we lifted the lockdown, or the government lifted the lockdowns and we went back to normal, we didn't really go back to normal. There's a psychological effect of that trauma of the pandemic, which we haven't really got over yet. And I think that contributed in some ways to the anger that the government began to experience.
I think it might have been Anthony Eden who once said, "Events, dear boy, events." When assessing how well a Prime Minister does, you can never account for events. And clearly it was 9/11 and the subsequent Iraq War that became the issue that defined Tony Blair's premiership. It was the financial crisis that became the issue that defined the premiership of Gordon Brown. And to some extent it was Brexit that defined the premiership of David Cameron, at least towards the end, and Theresa May. COVID will certainly define the premiership of Boris Johnson. But I suppose it's how a Prime Minister rises to the events that are thrown at them that is the mark of that Prime Minister. Boris Johnson came under a lot of criticism for slow reaction and sometimes what was described as confused reaction to the COVID pandemic, saying that he wouldn't want to lock down and then locking down, almost pleasing no one in that way of governing that Dominic Cummings described as like a shopping trolley, crashing from aisle to aisle without a clear sense of purpose. Do you think that's a fair description?
Well, I think it's the reverse, actually. I think the fact is that very few other people could have seen us through the pandemic through the lockdowns in a relatively united way. The fact that Boris Johnson was so obviously reluctant to impose a lockdown with all the damage it was likely to do, which we now see more and more of, I think actually encouraged people to think that actually he was on their side. And I think a Prime Minister who'd rushed in like some of the Secretaries of State around Boris might have done, locked everyone down and obviously enjoyed and relished the whole thing, and then locked harder, would have created a great deal more division. I think Boris actually helped us see us through. But I think there's more than that. I think the defining event of Boris's term is actually the delivery of Brexit. And I think that has been the most transformative thing that a Prime Minister has done since Mrs. Thatcher. It needs completion in respect of Northern Ireland. I think he'd have got round to that. Now it falls to Liz Truss to do it. And the other thing that will define him is the fact that he has been leading Europe in the war, in the response to Russia's illegal war. We've seen Germany and France and Italy all over the shop, not knowing what they're doing, what they're meant to be doing. But in the case of Boris, there's been clear leadership and solid support for Ukraine, which many European countries have rallied round and been glad of the leadership.
Yes, whilst it might have been issues surrounding COVID, or indeed the behaviour of people in the building behind me during the COVID pandemic that brought around the atmosphere that brought Boris Johnson down, it would be completely remiss of us to point to the many successes of his premiership. And I think we should dwell on some of those, because not least of all, defeating Jeremy Corbyn and fundamentally changing the Labour Party, much in the way that Margaret Thatcher changed the Labour Party in her 3 general election victories, in her 3 landslides. Boris Johnson changed the Labour Party in his 1 landslide, going from the sort of crank left leadership that we saw under Jeremy Corbyn. I can't imagine what the Labour Party would be saying about the crisis in Ukraine, for example, were Jeremy Corbyn still leader of that party. Perhaps under-remarked of the last 3 years is how Boris Johnson has not only changed the Tory party, but the entire landscape of British electoral politics.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I don't think the Labour Party has actually changed that much. It's true that the extreme leftists, the Corbynites, are not in charge anymore, but I still think it's the case that the leader of the great campaign in Parliament to overturn Brexit through having a bogus second referendum, Keir Starmer, is still leading the Labour Party. And although he says he's changed his spots, I'm very dubious about that. I think he's using that remark, that idea of changing his spots, in order to cover ever closer alignment with the European Union that would allow us one day, maybe in the distant future, to go back in, but certainly to stay under their laws in the meantime. So there have been changes. I think Labour had to change because they thought the public were on their side over Brexit up until December 2019, and they discovered with a resounding crash that the public was not on their side and they preferred Boris. That victory of Boris, that huge victory, is testament to his own personal rapport with the public, and that is something that has been of huge value to the Conservative Party, and it's given lots of MPs their seats, and now they've got to try and manage without.